Unbeknownst to the Americans, the first missile site in Cuba is now operational and can launch on 5 hours' notice.
One regiment was made combat ready on the 20th. Because of equipment delays, our regiment was not ready until the 25th.
In the Caribbean, the tension in the Soviet submarines is fed by an eerie radio silence.
Radio communication stopped. There was complete radio silence. There was no radio communication whatsoever, and that seemed odd to us. We guessed that there was an abnormal situation, but we didn't know what it was.
Shumkov is not in touch with his commanders, but the U.S. Navy is in touch with Shumkov.
We were being hunted by an anti-submarine aircraft. The carrier Essex was blocking us. Its mission was not to let us pass through the defenses. It was a problem without a solution.
In Washington, with the president absent, ExComm reaches consensus. Since a blockade has overtones of the infamous 1948 Soviet blockade of Berlin, Secretary of State Dean Rusk coins the term quarantine. Plans for airstrikes followed by an invasion of Cuba continue to be drawn up. In the meantime, quarantine is a go. Attorney General Robert Kennedy calls the president and suggests he return from Chicago to listen to the ExComm proposals. Pleading a cold, President Kennedy leaves Chicago. Oplan 316 for the invasion of Cuba has been underway for 10 months. But it now has a new immediacy. The timetable is for Marines to land in Cuba just 8 days after air attacks start. Oplan 316 involves 500,000 men, including 40,000 Marines, almost 15,000 paratroopers, 1,000 aircraft, and 180 ships. Elements of the 1st Marine Division leave Camp Pendleton, California, for a voyage through the Panama Canal and into the Caribbean. Tom Brooks was a naval intelligence officer with the task force.
Leaving San Diego was one of great enthusiasm, anxious to go get them. We're going to throw the Soviets out of there and, teach them this is our hemisphere, and we're going to do away with Castro once and for all.
As President Kennedy returns to the White House, he has no idea how many Soviets are in Cuba, and no idea that his troops may be heading toward a nuclear battlefield. On this same day, the CIA notices that at least one of the Soviet ballistic missile regiments in Cuba is ready to fire at any time. Kennedy had wanted any airstrikes to happen before the missiles were ready to fire. That window has now closed. The invasion calls for landings on the northeast and northwest coasts of Cuba, plus a breakout of Marines from Guantanamo Bay to attack what was thought to be 8,000 Soviet soldiers, fighting alongside the Cuban army. But the Soviet troops awaiting them in Cuba are far more numerous than the Americans ever estimated.
There was a great reluctance to believe that there were organized combat units in Cuba, and a reluctance to believe that they would actually engage U.S. forces.
Worse, Oplan 316 does not envision Soviet tactical nuclear weapons.
I hesitate to think even what that would have led to. We were not prepared at all for nuclear combat.
October 22nd, U.S. Navy ships are ordered to enforce a blockade of Cuba, setting the stage for a showdown with the Soviet convoy. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara orders U.S. families and dependents evacuated from Guantanamo Bay and dispatches Marines to reinforce the base. In Havana, Fidel Castro is also preparing for the worst.
At noon on the 22nd, it was announced that Kennedy would be addressing the nation that night. And we knew as soon as we heard that it would concern Cuba because they have discovered the missiles.
At
3:50 p.m., the armed forces were put on alert. At 5:45, the combat alarm was sounded, which means the men were in the trenches with weapons in their hands.
The United States military is on high alert, and the world braces for Kennedy's speech. At 7 p.m. on October 22nd, President Kennedy addresses the American public.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Kennedy's speech echoes throughout the world. The seriousness of the crisis is now exposed. U.S. Strategic Air Command places the armed forces to a higher defense condition. DEFCON 3.
When Kennedy announced that the missiles were deployed in Cuba, it was a very serious situation, and war was something that could happen at any moment.
We heard President Kennedy on the radio telling the American people that we were on the verge of thermonuclear war. About 10 divisions were gathering in Florida for the invasion of Cuba. We received orders from headquarters for a 4-hour readiness for the use of our nuclear-tipped torpedo. Khrushchev believed that if anyone should stop our convoys, then our submarines should sink them, while I considered this to be a risky approach.
U-2 photographs have convinced the experts in Washington that there are Soviet missiles in Cuba. But to make a conclusive case to the rest of the world, detailed close-up photographs are needed. The responsibility for capturing those photographs would fall on Navy Commander William Ecker of Light Photographic Squadron 62.
After I took off, there was a strong west wind, and I was flying just a compass course, and I happened to, about after 10 or 11 minutes, I looked up, and there at 11 o'clock was the Havana skyline, and I thought, oh boy, they're gonna know we're coming. So I just turned a little more to the right, headed out to Mariel, and then turned south for about 2 minutes, and I looked down, and there they were.
On the 22nd, they were flying at altitudes as low as 100 meters over us. We could even see the pilot in his helmet.